And Tanya, thank you for asking us.
So should we start or should I give a couple more minutes? Is there people still waiting, Vivian?
Nope. So I've disabled the waiting room. We have about 43 participants right now, but it's growing.
Okay. Okay, so I think we're about time to get started. Before we get started with the actual presentations, I just want to provide a few helpful reminders on Zoom. I think the easiest way to ask questions, if you hover down near the lower middle or the lower bottom of the Zoom, there's a chat function. So if you click on chat, you can ask questions that way. Over to the right of that is also reactions area. So if you have a question, you can also raise your hands. We've allocated some time after each one of the presentations to ask questions, so we should be able to go through those pretty well. So now I'm going to share my screen. Vivian, do I have controls for that yet?
Yes, you should be able to. It should be the button in between, right next to chat there. There you go.
Sorry, you'd think after a year that we'd all be pretty accustomed to all of this, but. So anyway, welcome to the 2021 In-Stream Flow Workshop. I'm Rob Veal from the Colorado Water Conservation Board. Here's a brief agenda of what we're going to be covering today. I'm going to start up by providing a quick overview of the program, how the program functions. Then we're going to have the recommended entities provide information about the new in-stream flow recommendations that they're bringing to the Cwcb. We'll allocate some time for questions after each one of the presentations, and then we'll also have time afterwards. If for some certain reason we aren't able to get to everyone's questions, I have my contact information as the last slide of my presentation, which we'll be posting to our website. So people can feel free to contact me through that information. So we're gonna start off. Here are the in-stream flow staff. We're led by the infamous Linda Bassi, and there's 7 of other us that work in the section. Most of them are on the call today. So starting with a bit of the program history, in the early 1970s, there was public concern over dry stream reaches. There was no mechanism within the water rights system to keep water within a stream for environmental preservation. And there was federal imposition of bypass flows in the Fry Arc project, and also threats of a ballot initiative to allow for privately held in-stream flows. So the Colorado legislature weighed in, and they wanted to do a couple of things. First, they wanted to maintain flows in streams to ensure reasonable preservation of the natural environment and to achieve a balance with other beneficial uses of water in the state. But just as important, they wanted to provide regulatory certainty for water users through continued reliance on the doctrine of prior appropriations. So in 1973, the legislature bipartisanly created the In-Stream Flow Program with the passage of Senate Bill 97. And what that did is it recognized the need to correlate the activities of mankind with some reasonable preservation of the natural environment, and invested the Colorado Water Conservation Board with the authority on behalf of the people of the state of Colorado to appropriate, acquire such waters of natural streams and lakes as may be required to preserve the natural environment to a reasonable degree. So what does that actually do? So just in case you guys don't know, I use these acronyms a lot. So hopefully, in-stream flow, we use ISF, and then NLLs are natural lake levels. So in-stream flow and natural lake level rights are in-channel or in-lake appropriations of water. They're recognized as beneficial uses of water within the state. They're made exclusively by the Colorado Water Conservation Board. So the Cwcb is the only entity in the state that can hold these type of water rights. They're to preserve the natural environment to a reasonable degree, and they're for minimum flows between specific points on a stream or levels on a natural lake. They're administered within the state's water priority system. So the water rights that we'll be talking today, the recommendations, if they do become water rights, the earliest they would become water rights would be in 2022, or have a 2022 appropriation date. And like every other water right in the state, we're entitled to, the in-stream flow water rights are entitled to stream conditions existing at that time of appropriation. So since 1973, the CWCB has appropriated close to 1,700 different stream segments. It covers about 9,700 miles. And they've also appropriated 482 natural lakes. While not a discussion point for the in-stream flow workshop today, the CWCB has also acquired over 43 water right donations or long-term contracts for water totaling 945 miles. This next slide kind of shows the distribution of those in-stream flow water rights throughout the state. I'm going to pick out a few just to highlight some of the different natural environments that we're seeking to protect. So the first one is Cwcb Creek, and that's located out near John Martin Reservoir. And the purpose of that appropriation was to protect waterfall habitat. Moving over into Division 5, there's Hanging Lake and Dead Horse Creek, which a lot of people have probably hiked. We have an in-stream flow water right there to protect the riparian vegetation and the unique hydrologic and geological features. It's also to help protect the black swifts, a special type of bird that live up there. Down near tributary to the San Miguel River is Horsefly Creek. That appropriation was to protect for the macro invertebrate community. There's also the Mexican Cut Ponds at Rocky Mountain Biological Laboratory. These are unique glacial ponds and provide habitat for salamanders, and Rocky Mountain Biological Laboratories have been doing research up on those for many, many years. And then finally, there's Big and Little Dominguez Creeks. This is a wilderness area, and the appropriation was to help protect the fish and riparian vegetation. So how does the in-stream flow water right go about being? Well, the first thing that has to be done is the board is required to make 3 findings. The first is that a natural environment exists. Typically, this is identified by a fishery, but as the previous slide indicated, that's not exclusively the case. So quantification of the recommendation is brought to us by the recommending entity. Typically, they use the R2 cross model, which I'll go into in more detail in a few slides. And that's how the flow quantification for those recommendations is developed. Separately, the second finding the board has to make is that a natural environment will be preserved by the water for appropriation. This is determined by water right and hydrologic investigation. The general CWCB policy is to show water is available 50% of the time. So that's why we work to have a daily median hydrology when available. The third finding is that no material injury to other water rights. As I said before, these would be new junior water rights in the system, so they shouldn't have an effect on existing senior appropriations. But there's also a clause in the statute 3792-1023B, and this is the recognition of existing undecreed uses and exchanges. So if a water user on a specific creek has been doing something historically, we can recognize that in our in-stream flow decree. So as mentioned before, we're going to talk a little bit about R2 cross. It's a single transect method. It's collecting stream flow measurements and channel geometry to model hydraulic parameters of average depth, velocity, and wetter perimeter. So the R2 cross parameters were created by Colorado Parks and Wildlife in the early 1970s. So the biological flow recommendations are based on these hydraulic parameters. Typically, a 3 of 3 is required for the summer flow, so that would be the high flow period of the year. And we use 2 of the 3 parameters to develop the winter flow recommendations. Many of the original R2 cross recommendations were based solely on the 2 of 3, so there's single flow rates throughout the entire year. So if any of these recommended entities are proposing an increase, that would be to get that 3 of 3 parameter in a new separate junior water right. As you can see from the table below, average velocity the requirements for the average velocity parameter don't change as the top width of the stream gets bigger. But as that does get bigger, average depth and wetter perimeter parameters do change. So how does this all come out? So here's an example of an R2 cross output As you can see, we're starting this diagram, this very detailed schematic of the fish in the stream channel at the top with the entire 100% of the wetter perimeter full. As we move down, as the water level moves down, you can see that this is where all three of those parameters are being met. In this case, it's under average velocity. So what we'll do there is we'll use this table to help interpolate the required flow amounts needed for that 3 of 3 recommendation. As you go down further in the table, you can see this is where the 2 of the 3 parameters are being met. And here, this is for the average depth, and we would also use that to interpolate the flow recommendation based on that output. If you go all the way down to just meeting one criteria, one of the parameters, it's been determined not to be sufficient for a long term to meet the biological needs of a fishery. So that's why we try to rely on the 2 of 3 and 3 of 3 parameters. So what does an in-stream flow actually look like? So this is a picture of the Little Cimarron River. So this picture was taken with a measured flow in the creek of 13.5 CFS. And as you can see from the slide, the 3 of 3 parameter for this river is 13 CFS. So this roughly approximate what an in-stream flow looks like. The second finding the board has to make is that water is available for the appropriation. So staff does its own independent analysis. We use a water balance approach driven by the best available data. We do a statistical analysis of data to provide that median daily flow hydrograph when possible. Ideally, there'll be a long-term gauge located at the bottom of every in-stream flow recommendation. This is usually never the case. So we use short-term gauges. We may install some temporary gauges, do some spot flow measurements, and rely on diversion records if available. When there's really limited data, we'll use StreamStats, which is a USGS program, to help provide a mean monthly hydrograph. On larger streams, a handful of times we've used detailed modeling through the Colorado Decision Support System, but that's fairly rare in our program's history. And we also take in additional information from water commissioners, landowners, ditch or reservoir operators, and resource managers. So one way to think about water availability is it is a necessary requirement that may be imposed upon to limit the biological quantification model findings. So the next series of slides, I'll kind of go through how that would work. So as you can see here in this graph, you have the 3 of 3 flow recommendation, the 2 of 3 flow recommendation developed out of R2 cross, using those parameters of average depth, wetter perimeter, and average velocity. The recommended entity will kind of shape that into what they think the hydrograph and the timing is of the proposed recommendation. Staff will then independently develop its own water availability analysis using the data that I described in the previous slide. So in this case here, you can see that we were able to develop a median flow hydrograph. What we'll do then is we'll take that initial biological flow recommendation from the recommended entities, and we'll superimpose it over the water availability analysis. And staff from the CWCB will collaborate with the biological experts from the recommended entities to kind of see if there's areas where staff from the CWCB doesn't believe that water would be available for appropriation. What we'll do is we'll work together to try to zero in on the exact timing of those in-stream flow rates, and if necessary, lower those rates to correspond to what water is available for appropriation until we get a final flow recommendation that we would eventually bring to the CWCB board for appropriation. So here's a timeline of events of how an in-stream flow water right can be appropriated. So at the minimum, it's a 3-year process. So in the blue rectangle to the left, that is when the recommendation is developed by the recommending entities. So the past year or years, these recommending entities that will be presenting in-stream flow recommendations today have been going out, collecting that R2 cross data, collecting fisheries data, doing spot measurements to develop the recommendations. So we're at the first arrow in this green box pointing down. We're at the in-stream flow workshop. So this is where is a public forum for these recommending entities to provide this information to the public and to the CWCB staff. So just like you, I have no idea what recommendations are coming today from these entities. This starts off a formal notice process. We'll be sending public notice out in March and again in November of this year to the Instream Flow subscription mailing list. There will also be agenda items at the March and November meeting describing that such notice. During this year, the CWCB staff will work, as mentioned before, on our water availability analysis. We'll also be reviewing all the biological data that's provided to us by the recommended entities and conducting other outreach to different stakeholders within the desired area. Once that process has been completed and staff has a recommendation that they feel satisfies the 3 findings, they'll bring it to the CWCB board, asking them to form their intent to appropriate. This starts the formal notice and comment period in January. Public comment continues on for another couple of months until in May on any uncontested appropriations recommendations, the CWCB can take final action. If there is a contested appropriation, there could be a hearing and final action would be at the September board meeting. It's important to keep in mind that once all this is done and the board has taken final action, then the CWCB, like any other water right user in the state, would file a water court application to get those water rights decreed. So the next couple of series of slides I'm going to provide areas where the public or anyone that's interested can find information about these in-stream flows. So this is a screen capture from our CWCB website. If you go under focus area, ecosystem health, into in-stream flows, that's where all this information is located. The first item I'm going to bring up is highlighted in the red oval down in the bottom right. That's the in-stream flow water right database. If you click onto that link, you're brought to the Colorado Information Marketplace. This is a clearinghouse of all kinds of data throughout the state. There's many different categories. Water is one of those specific categories, and this is where the CWCB in-stream flow data is housed for decreed and pending in water court water rights. As you can see here, you can export this data, you can filter this data, you can visualize this data in any way you see fit. And that has all those previous water rights I described that have been decreed to the CWCB. So the next area that is helpful is down right below that in this red oval is the Cwcb Map Viewer. So the Cwcb Map Viewer has several different layers with in-stream flow reaches on it. So it has layers that describe the decreed in-stream flow reaches, describes the pending ones that are pending in water court, and also provides a layer for the recommended reaches as well. So on this platform, you can navigate, zoom into those different areas to kind of see geographically where these separate in-stream flow water rights are located. There's also a bunch of other layers that you can include into that data set, including structures, and there's just a myriad of different data you can include in there. So back to the CWCB homepage, the in-stream flow homepage. If you click on this in-stream flow and natural lake level appropriations, you'll be able to find this left-hand tab. So this left-hand tab has previous year's recommendations. In the next several weeks, we will have the recommendations that are brought forth today. We'll be providing that as a separate entry. So that'll go right above this 2021 recommendations tab. And this is where you'll be able to find all different kinds of information specific to the in-stream flow recommendations. So that will include all the notices that were, the public notices that were sent out. We'll have links to all the presentations that are going to be conducted today. And there's also an ability to click on these in-stream flow recommendations in Google Earth. So if people are more familiar with using Google Earth than some other kind of GIS platform, there's the ability to do it there. So this will have a listing of all the in-stream flow recommendations currently that have been proposed to the CWCB staff. We'll provide the water division, the stream name, any supporting documentation that we have, who the stakeholder recommending entity is, the county, and then on the far right will be the status. So as you can see here from this 2021 in-stream flow appropriation, you can see that there's some of these appropriations that have been postponed until the next year. So I believe at this time we have about 45 in-stream flow recommendations that we received at the workshop in previous years. Those are all on this list, and those are all at various stages of completion. Most of them have additional data collection needs or some stakeholder outreach needs, and the status is updated to indicate where they are on that process. Lastly, the last slide I have here is to sign up for notification at the DNR portal. So you can create an account to have the ability to get, notification from the Cwcb in-stream flow subscription mailing list. You can either sort that you can sign up for each individual division or multiple divisions where all the in-stream flow water rights divisions. There's also the ability to sign up for all the other Cwcb notification lists in that area as well. So like I said, staff in the Cwcb, me included, are always happy to talk to any concerned stakeholders about any of the issues they have. So this is my contact information. Once again, this slide and this whole presentation will be on the Cwcb website if you need to locate my contact information in the future. So that's what I had for the quick overview of the Cwcb program. I don't know if we have any questions in the chat as of yet, or if anybody would like to raise their hand or unmute themselves and ask a question. There's time available now. Okay, with no questions at this point, I would invite Roy Smith from the Bureau of Land Management to present the BLM in-stream flow recommendations they have.
Hi, Rob. I'm going to attempt to share my screen, and if you can confirm when you see it, that would be appreciated.
So I should have noticed at the beginning, this is obviously the first in-stream flow virtual workshop, so there might be some kinks involved.
Yeah. Right.
Yes, I can see your screen, Roy.
Okay, great. I will proceed with presenting then. First of all, I'll introduce myself because there are many of you in the audience who I haven't met previously. My name is Roy Smith. I'm the statewide water rights and in-stream flow protection coordinator for the Bureau of Land Management, and I'm also our Wild and Scenic Rivers program lead. I've been working for the BLM for 29 years here in Colorado, so I'm really familiar with the landscape in the state. And as a little bit of history before I jump into this, BLM has been making in-stream flow recommendations to the Cwcb for over 25 years now, and the Cwcb has acted on and protected more than 200 stream segments that have been recommended by BLM. So BLM streams are now a significant part of the total portion of protected miles in the state. So we work with the Cwcb just because one of our main motivations is we like to avoid the situation of where when facilities are on federal lands, water diversion and conveyance facilities, we like to avoid, if possible, the situation where the feds have to impose a bypass flow to protect streams in and around those diversion structures. And one of the tools that we use to avoid doing that is reliance upon the in-stream flow program. So with that, I'm going to turn to my presentation, and let me change it to a slideshow format. Okay, and I guess unlike previous years where I might have anywhere from 10 to 15 streams to bring to this workshop, this year it's only a handful just because of issues associated with collecting field data during the year last year. We got a very late start as we figured out COVID procedures to keep everybody safe and healthy as we collected data. And then drought hit and stream flows, the bottom dropped out. So we lost the flows that we needed to do the work. So this year's list is short. And what you're seeing here is one of the streams on our list. I'm going to go by water division in numerically ascending order. So this is a picture of the San Miguel River in Water Division 4. We're not making a recommendation on the San Miguel River, but this is just one of the streams that we've worked on historically. The first stream I want to talk about, and hey, Rob, can you see my cursor when I move it around the screen?
Try moving it right now and I'll tell you.
Can you see it now?
I cannot.
Okay, can you see it now?
I can see it now.
Okay, I'll stick to that using that screen then. Okay, so one of the streams that we want to work in Water Division 4 is known as Goat Creek. And for reference, the San Miguel River is to the north off this map. Telluride's off to the east, Natarita's off to the west, and we're south of the San Miguel River. Here is Miramonte Reservoir, and here is Lone Cone, a well-known geographical feature in this part of the world. And the Goat Creek drains one of the flanks of Lone Cone. It starts up in this neighborhood and it sort of follows the route of my arrow here until its lower confluence with Beaver Creek. And Beaver Creek is over here and is a much larger stream. The natural environment on Goat Creek is a cutthroat trout fishery. And we're in the process of verifying what lineage those are and figuring out whether that's a lineage that's really important in terms of our conservation plans for protecting Colorado River cutthroat trout. This stream has a nice community of macroinvertebrates, and it also has really good riparian cover, willow, alder, and spruce. It's a small stream, so these flow rates are pretty small. We're recommending 0.75 CFS during snowmelt runoff, 0.6 during the shoulder in late summer through fall, and then 0.4 during the winter. But we do plan to go and collect additional data this summer, and that could result in some modifications to these flow rates. Stakeholders on Goat Creek would include the Norwood Water Commission, because they have some conditional but undeveloped water rights in and along this creek. San Miguel County, where the stream is located, Southwestern Water Conservation District, this is within their jurisdictional area, and there are some private landowners along the creek. What's nice about Goat Creek, and the reason we believe it supports cutthroat trout and why we found water there during a really severe drought, is it has base flows that are consistently supported by discharge from springs. We saw lots of evidence of vegetation that shows very, very consistent base flows. But there is also a small surge when the snow melts on Lone Cone and surges down through the creek. And I've already mentioned some of these water rights along the creek, but they're quite large because Norwood Water Commission back in 2010 identified some alternative water sources for its long-term municipal supply. I'm going to go next to Water Division 5. If you're wondering what this is what we call an ice wheel that forms along the upper Colorado River on BLM lands pretty much every winter when it gets cold enough, and it just spins like this all winter long. It's a pretty fascinating phenomena. One of the creeks that we want to make a recommendation on is called Spruce Creek, and in terms of location, on the lower right-hand side here is Green Mountain Reservoir. So, Summit County is mainly to the southeast here, along with Dillon and Dillon Reservoir. This is the highway that goes along Green Mountain Reservoir and is heading north toward Kremling off the screen. And so the Spruce Creek watershed originates in the Gore Range, about right here. It's not a super high altitude watershed, but it starts on the National Forest and goes down through this valley and then hits the county border here with Summit and Grand County, and then goes down till it meets with the Blue River. And we're proposing that this in-stream flow finish at the Hoagland Canal headgate because that headgate has the capability of sweeping the creek. This is another cutthroat trout stream, Colorado River cutthroat trout. We verified green lineage, and we are managing it as a conservation population. We've got a really nice set of macroinvertebrates. It's a spruce willow riparian community. And as you can see from this picture, the watershed starts in pretty heavily forested land and then comes down through this valley and then flows through more open areas through meadow habitat. Whoops, excuse me. Our preliminary flow rates on this stream are also small, 0.9 during snowmelt runoff, 0.45 during late summer through fall, and then 0.3 during the winter. And again, because we were collecting data during a drought period, we want to collect some more data during this summer, and that may slightly modify these flow numbers. But as you can see, it's a very densely vegetated creek that has nice cold temperatures for supporting a cold water fish community. On this particular creek, it's just pretty much snowmelt driven hydrology. There's no gauge data available on it, but the water availability analysis made somewhat simpler because there are no water rights within this reach, and our proposed lower terminus is at a water right location that probably has diversion records. Stakeholders include several private landowners along the creek, Summit County and Grand County, where the creek is located, the U.S. Forest Service, because the creek headwaters are on Forest Service lands, and then Blue Valley Ranch, because the reach terminates on lands owned and managed by that ranch. The next creek that we will make a recommendation on in Water Division 5 is Rock Creek. And to orient you toward the location of this creek, this is the Colorado River right here. And I guess I'll keep the arrow moving in the flow direction. Here's the community of Parshall. So Hot Sulphur Springs is to the east. Kremling is over here to the west. And Rock Creek drains into the Colorado River. It starts up here in the headwaters, flows down through a pond, flows down through a valley where there's some agricultural activity, and then it just keeps on moving down through BLM and private lands, goes under the highway, and then comes into the Colorado River here. So there's a lot of different landowners along this creek. This creek has a brook trout fishery, has a mayflies and caddisflies as a food source. It's a willow and sedge riparian community, and it's forested lands in the headwater, and then there's quite a bit of agricultural lands lower in the reach. Our preliminary flow rates are 1.35 CFS during snowmelt runoff, 0.7 CFS during the late summer and fall, and 0.5 for base flows during the winter. And this is, you'll hear this many times, we're going to go collect some more data here to verify what we collected during last year's drought. Rock Creek will present an interesting and challenging water availability project for the board staff because the hydrology is fairly complex and altered. There's a big spring that provides the base discharge for the creek, but then there's a little bit of snowmelt runoff, and then during the irrigation season, it does transport some imported water that's delivered by the Musgrave ditch, which diverts water from Corral Creek to the east. And in addition, there are 4 water rights in the proposed in-stream flow reach that might modify the water availability. So the stakeholders along this creek are the multiple land and water right owners that I referenced and Grand County. The third creek that we are focused on in Water Division 5 is Kinney Creek, in the same sort of neighborhood, set further to the east. With my cursor here, I'm pointing to Hot Sulphur Springs. This is the Colorado River flowing from east to west. And the terminus that we are thinking of is the headwaters. And then the creek flows down through this broad canyon. And then at the confluence with McQuarrie Creek is what we're suggesting as a lower terminus. This is a picture of some of the fish in the creek. This is, again, Colorado River cutthroat trout. This is a blue lineage trout, and it is managed as a core conservation population under our conservation plan for Colorado River cutthroat trout. There's a good macro community, and that indicates very high water quality. And for riparian community, we've got willows, alders, sedges, and grasses. I will note that this particular creek already has an in-stream flow water right on it. It's 1 CFS year round. It was one of those creeks that Rob mentioned, where the in-stream flow rate was determined by looking at 2 of the 3 in-stream flow criteria that Rob described. And based upon our data, we are recommending preliminarily an increase of 0.7 CFS from May 1st to September 30th during the warm part of the year. And we think that increase is justified because we really want to provide the maximum amount of habitat for this core conservation population, but we will be collecting additional data during this summer. The water availability is driven by snowmelt runoff, and there's no gauge data available, but the downstream ditches do have good diversion records. There is one water right within the proposed reach, and that's the Dennis ditch, which is decreed for 2.75 CFS. I will note a major change has occurred in this watershed since we collected the data, which is called the East Troublesome Fire. Most of the headwaters of this watershed, including I think this picture that you see here, have now been burned. So we will be back out this summer collecting additional data to see what that burn did to water quality, sedimentation, and flow rates along the creek. The stakeholders on this creek include multiple land and water rights owners, the Forest Service, who manage the headwaters, Grand County, where the creek is located, and Colorado Parks and Wildlife, because they have an interest in that core conservation population. And the last stream in the handful I want to talk about is in Water Division 6. This is a picture of the Yampa River as it flows through BLM lands in the extreme western part of Water Division 6. But the creek that we are going to speak of today is in the eastern part of Water Division 6 near north of Steamboat. So for reference for location, this lake right here is Steamboat Lake, and that is surrounded by Steamboat Lake State Park, managed by Colorado Parks and Wildlife. This geographical feature here is Hans Peak, and Deep Creek drains the west flank of Hans Creek. And it starts here and then it goes down through this valley until very heavily forested, and then it emerges in a meadow habitat. This is where the BLM ownership and the private ownership are located, and then it flows into an arm of Steamboat Lake. The natural environment there is a hybrid fishery combined with a cross of combined cutthroat trout and rainbow trout. The riparian community is spruce, willow, and alder. And I mentioned that it starts in densely forested landscape, and here it's showing a picture in some of the open meadow habitat that it flows through with Hans Peak in the background. The proposed flow rates on the creek are 2.5 CFS during snowmelt runoff, 1.4 CFS during late summer, and 0.3 CFS during the remainder of the year, because after snowmelt runoff, this creek goes to pretty low base flows. The water availability picture here is that it's a headwaters stream. It's snowmelt driven, and there's no gauge data available. But water availability calculations should not be that difficult because there's only one water right that we're aware of for 1 CFS, and we haven't had recorded diversions from that particular structure for more than 17 years. So we think it's fairly straightforward. The stakeholders on this creek will be Colorado Parks and Wildlife because they manage the end of the creek where it dumps into Steamboat Lake, the Forest Service where the creek originates, Trout County where the stream is located. This is within the boundaries of the Upper Yampa Water Conservancy District, and they have some water rights in and around Steamboat Lake, so they could possibly be interested. And we do have some private landowners along the creek. So that's a quick summary of the limited amount of field work that we were able to do last summer and the recommendations that we'd like to proceed with. And Rob, if anybody has any questions, I am open to them. And I will be sharing this PowerPoint with Rob so that he can post it on the CWCB website and you can access it.
So I don't know, does anyone have any questions for Roy? Okay, up next, oh, Eric.
Yeah, this is Eric Garduno. I'm the aquatic biologist for Colorado Parks and Wildlife out of Montrose, and I just wanted to verify that Goat Creek is indeed a conservation population of green lineage Colorado River cutthroat trout.
That's why I said we're verifying what the cutthroat population is comprised of, because we're aware of higher in the watershed that there's green lineage cutthroat trouts, but we haven't been able to verify what lineage they are in Goat Creek. So that's still an open question, Eric.
Oh, okay. I think the ones in Goat Creek are green lineage, but we can talk later.
Yeah. Yeah, we want to verify that because we know that the green lineage fish are around, but we haven't verified them that they occupy Goat Creek.
Okay.
Any other questions from Roy before we move on to Katie? Thanks, Roy.
Sure.
So up next is Katie Birch from Colorado Parks and Wildlife.
Yeah, hi everyone, and thanks Rob. I'm gonna attempt to share my screen also. And Roy, I think it looks like you have to unshare.
Ooh. I don't know how to do that.
Oh, there we go. Okay,
Yeah.
I've gained control.
Okay.
Let's see. How's that? Can you see it?
I can see it, Katie, yes.
Yes.
Okay. Perfect. So for those who don't know me, my name's Katie Birch. I'm the Instream Flow Program Specialist for Colorado Parks and Wildlife. And like Roy, I'm here today to talk about upcoming efforts. And I'm gonna try to remind folks who haven't been here during past presentations kind of how CPW decides upon and prioritizes in-stream flow candidates. We're really trying to focus on high conservation value fisheries as well as high recreational value fisheries. And we've been shifting to try to leverage local knowledge both within CPW and from nonprofit and governmental private partners. So we're continuing to work and partner with folks, including Larimer County, the national parks, and the Forest Service. And I just want to put in the plug that anyone else who has an idea for an in-stream flow candidate and doesn't feel like they have the expertise to go out and collect data, I'd be happy to partner and try to work through candidates other folks have. And then the last recent shift that we've been undertaking is trying to provide water users and the public with more advanced notice. We're trying to really vet these candidates earlier and collaborate with water users when they're interested. So again, happy to take concerns or just try to get the word out sooner. And the CWCB has been working really hard to make that happen. So here's kind of a look at where I'm planning on working for CPW's upcoming efforts around the state. This is going to look a lot like my presentation last year. Very similar to Roy, it was a really challenging year. Not only were we hit with a pandemic and limited staffing resources, we also saw really dry conditions throughout the state. And by the time my legs were under me, it just was too late. And a lot of these streams that I'm working in had just too low of flows. So not a ton of new information within this PowerPoint, but I will go through it again just to remind folks who weren't at this workshop last year what we're undertaking. So in Division 6 in the Yampa and White River Basin, we're continuing to work in the White River. This is a continuation of an effort really targeting native species and the important recreational fishery in the White. So we're working in the North and South Fork White River and major tributaries to protect not only some populations of Colorado River cutthroat trout, but also sport fish. And, you know, recognizing all the work that's going into the White River algae study, we think CPW believes that flow protection is an important part of the picture moving forward. So a closer dive into what we're looking at in the North Fork White, we're looking at, you know, these handful of tributaries up in the North Fork: Mirror Creek, Bear Creek, Picket Pin, Hoskins, Lynx, Paradise, Big Fish Creek. I think I forgot one in there, but you know, data's been collected on these, and we're working with a landowner to make sure that their concerns are addressed. We want to recognize that they have some ditch operations on a number of these tributaries, and so we're working proactively and have tried to postpone this to continue to make sure that we're all on the same page before moving forward. In that same vein, we've postponed East Marvin Creek. We need to continue to collect some additional data there. So those are a couple of tributaries we could be looking towards in 2021, should those conversations continue to progress. And then looking beyond 2021, we're really going to be focused on the South Fork White, the main stem and tributaries. There's no in-stream flow in the South Fork White, kind of above this major confluence, Swede Creek. And so we're going to work on this main stem. It's going to take a lot of outreach, and there's a lot of water users and operations on the river. So we want to make sure folks are comfortable with an in-stream flow before we move forward. And then this yellow tributary is Hill Creek, which we'll be looking at in some of the other tributaries of the South Fork White. So moving on to Division 1 in the South Platte Basin, CPW's efforts are very focused on cutthroat, greenback cutthroat trout conservation populations, because there's really only a handful of these. So this unnamed tributary to Duck Creek, which is between Square Tops Lake and Duck Lake, kind of at the base of Square Top Mountain and just catty corner to Mount Beardstat, is a stream that we are actively working on reclaiming for greenback cutthroat. That's in progress, and we're hoping to coincide the in-stream flow with when we get greenback back in the creek. So that's something to look forward to. Another greenback stream is Herman Gulch. Herman Gulch has an existing in-stream flow of 2 CFS year-round, and we're looking at whether an enlargement is warranted. Kind of catty corner to Herman Gulch was Dry Gulch, which I mentioned last year, and that was an in-stream flow that we recommended in 2021, and the board formed its intent to appropriate on yesterday or the day before that. So continuing on past efforts, we're going to continue to work with Cwcb National Recreation Area, the National Parks staff there, and we're working on a recommendation on Pine Creek and a possible enlargement on Cwcb Creek as well. These are streams that are of value to the parks, and yeah, again, we just saw too low a flow in September of this year, so we're going to need to continue to collect additional data this coming summer, probably earlier in the year. And continuation of past efforts in Division 4, Cow Creek, tributary to the Uncompadre River. This is a stream that has native species, specifically bluehead sucker, and a wild trout fishery that CPW is very interested in protecting, and I'll give some more updates on Cow Creek in the next slide. And in that same vein, we're looking at recommending an in-stream flow on the Uncompahgre River below Ridgeway Reservoir, this reach on Ridgeway Reservoir State Park. And this reach is a very popular fishery. It's a big destination and probably the most heavily fished reach in all of Montrose and Ouray County, and possibly even a greater distance. It's really, this fishery is very popular. It's kind of on the cusp of being a gold middle water standards. But it's just not there. And I think CPW would like to see some winter flows that are a bit higher than what they currently are at now, and an in-stream flow protection to kind of be the mechanism for that. So another thing worth mentioning on Ridgeway Reservoir below on the Uncompahgre below Ridgeway Reservoir is that there's some habitat improvements that CPW is undertaking through our capital improvement fund. And so this would dovetail really nicely with some additional winter water and would really prop up the fishery in a way that I think would be strongly supported by the community and all the anglers who visit the stretch, as well as the parks. So that's an effort that we would like to undertake, and we'd like to work with the water users to talk about how this is achievable. And then jumping back to Cow Creek, the update for 2020 is that we have finalized our in-stream flow recommendations, our initial biological recommendations, and those are the numbers you can see here in the table. These numbers will likely be reduced due to water availability, and so we're working with Cwcb staff on that currently. We're hoping that this recommendation will be ready for the board in time for their March board meeting, and again are willing to engage and talk with water users about these numbers and what we think it'll take to protect the fishery in Cow Creek. And just wanted to throw up a couple pictures too of all of the fish that have been sampled in Cow Creek within the last 2 years. So those were kind of a continuation of past efforts by my predecessor, and I'll now highlight some of the new efforts that we'll be working on. And I don't want to bump up against time, so I'll jump through these quickly. But in the North Fork of the Gunnison, we're looking at potential in-stream flows on Main, Middle, and West Hubbard Creeks with kind of an intercept dividing line at the Overland Canal intercept. And another North Fork Gunnison in-stream flow candidate is Cunningham Creek and Sink Creek, which is a tributary to Cunningham Creek. These are all core conservation populations of green lineage cutthroat that CPW really wants to see protected. So that's why they've risen to being prioritized by us. And similarly, we're looking at Beaver Ponds Creek and East Fork Dry Creek on the Uncompahgre Plateau, which are tributary to Dry Creek, and then kind of on the other side of the divide in the San Miguel Basin, Kelly Creek, Red Canyon Creek, and Big A Creek. Red Canyon Creek has an existing in-stream flow, so we'd be looking at a possible enlargement there. And Kelly Creek and Big A do not have in-stream flow protections. And then another new effort in Division 1 focused on some of our plains species is West Plum Creek. And so CPW is interested in recommending West Plum Creek through multiple segments. This is a very important fishery. It's home to northern red-bellied dace and common shiner, which are state species of greatest conservation need. The population in West Plum Creek is really the last stronghold of these two populations, and it's also home to a handful of other SGCN species, including the Iowa darter and the northern leopard frog. So we're interested in working with some of the water users and collecting additional data in this coming year. And then the last effort that again CPW is undertaking is Cottonwood Creek, which is tributary to Alvarado Creek, although it doesn't actually reach Alvarado Creek. This is a stream CPW is exploring for reclamation of the Hayden Creek cutthroat trout. These trout were salvaged out of Hayden Creek during the fire and essentially contain a very unique phenotype dating back centuries to a museum specimen found from Twin Lakes. So within the Arkansas Basin, they're the closest thing we have to a native Arkansas Basin cutthroat. And Cottonwood Creek is the first of a handful of populations that will be reestablished in a number of years. And again, we're looking to secure an in-stream flow protection coincident with the cutthroat reclamation. And I think that is all. I'm happy to answer any questions folks have.
So there was one question in the chat from, I believe, Dave Tosick about what the reach is for the Cow Creek ISF recommendation. And Katie, I would say that at this point, it's from Nate Creek, the confluence with Nate Creek, down to the confluence with the Uncompadre, but it's still under evaluation. It may get shorter, but that's the current recommendation. Is that correct?
That's correct. So the Cow Creek in-stream flow was originally noticed as the forest boundary down to the confluence with the Uncompadre. We've since shortened that as of 2020 to Nate Creek down to the confluence with the Uncompadre. And, you know, in looking at water availability, it's very likely that that will be shortened further to either Lou Creek or Deer Creek. And that's an ongoing conversation, Dave. We don't have answers at the moment, but we can talk more offline as we try to sort out what makes the most sense operationally.
And Katie, I just want to mention one thing too. It appeared in one of your slides that with the White River slides that you're talking about 2021, that we won't be seeking appropriation in 2021, but we'll be still continue to do stakeholder outreach in 2021 with appropriation in 2022. Is that correct?
That's correct for the South Fork, yes. And were you, Rob, asking about the 2022 recommendations?
Well, no, just that we won't be moving forward with the White River ones until next January at the earliest, January 2022.
Yeah, thanks for clarifying that.
Yeah, I wrote a check yesterday that said 2020, so hopefully they catch it. I don't know why I want to keep having 2020 be relevant, but
yeah, thanks for catching that.
okay. Is there any other questions for Katie at the moment?
Perfect.
And if there's okay, well, with that, I think we'll move on to Julie Nania from High Country Conservation Advocates.
Hey everyone, thanks for the intro, Rob. I'm gonna try to get this screen share going as well. Let me go over that. All right, so this should be a bit briefer. We are only recommending 2 streams this year. We're in Water Division 4, so kind of in the upper part of the Gunnison Basin. And this year, our first candidate is Lattice Creek. So Lattice Creek is one of our bigger tributaries to the Taylor River. We started looking at this one because it has one of those flat rate flows with no seasonality that only met 2 of the 3 criteria that Rob was talking about earlier. And so it seemed to be a good candidate to look at some of that hydrologic variability. So on my screen, you can kind of see where the Lattice Creek Basin is. Up here is the Taylor Reservoir, and it covers this area, partially originating in the Fossil Ridge Wilderness area, but then also extending up into Union Park. So it has a recreational fishery. There is a Forest Service campground up there, and it's one of those that folks love to go and camp out on in the summer and partially go and explore some of those high mountain pools. And then a really kind of interesting riparian area. It goes from everything from beaver ponds to running through a kind of steeper canyon nearer to the headwaters, and then actually opening back up into Union Park. So once again, it's got an existing in-stream flow rate of 5 CFS, and this proposal is seeking to look at some of that seasonal variability and to add an increased summer flow on Lattice Creek. So the reach that we are looking at stems from the headwaters of Lattice Creek up in kind of the Cameron Mountain, flows down through Union Park, through that kind of steep canyon called Union Canyon, joins South Lattice Creek here, and then joins the Taylor River at the terminus. So it's a total of about 10.3 miles long. And our increase is an increase of 3.5 CFS to add that summer variability. So this is one of those reaches that didn't have good gauge data. They actually didn't even have any historic gauge data. So we looked at a combination of stream stats and R2 cross to do kind of this initial availability analysis. In terms of other water rights up there, they do have a few small springs that are actively used. The Forest Service has one of those at the campgrounds, but there aren't any active diversions up there. And many of the old rights up there had been canceled because they had been part of the proposal for the Union Park Reservoir for you water nerds on this presentation. There are also a few actually privately held in-stream flow rights that were some of those that were grandfathered in earlier in the program days. However, we thought it was important that the CWCB hold these rights and have the ability to oversee and administer those as well. So in terms of stakeholders up there, there's a significant amount of Forest Service land in the basin. There is a little bit of spotted private land in there, namely in the form of smaller inholdings. So let's see, we've got our kind of standard go-to, which is the Upper Gunnison River Water Conservancy District, since it is in their kind of basin purview. Gunnison County, CPW, and then any other potential folks that might be interested in that area as a fishery or other, or as kind of a potential spring rights owner. Our second recommendation is Italian Creek. This is another stream that's actually higher up in that same Taylor River basin. This one comes in above the reservoir to the upper Taylor River. I really like this photo here because it's a great characterization of that area. The Taylor River is kind of built by numerous tributaries that come in up above into this beautiful kind of beaver willow wetland complex area. So here's a map of the watershed area that we're looking at. So the proposed in-stream flow reach here is starting at the confluence of Italian Creek and South Italian Creek and running to the confluence with the Taylor River. This is another flat rate in-stream flow rate that we're hoping to add some seasonal variability to. So it's got an existing rate of 2.5 CFS. One of the reasons that we were looking at this reach, which is about 2.5 miles long, was because it's actually one of those reaches that does have cutthroat. So we were interested in this for the cutthroat up there and also to kind of try to add back in some of that seasonal variability. So you'll see that it's a modest increase of 0.7 CFS to try to reshape that hydrograph. Much like Katie and Roy mentioned, we did have some low flow conditions this year. I think this is about as low as it gets up there. And we're able to get an earlier season as well, but we may consider going back out there this year to try to get a more representative year because it was pretty sparse last summer. So once again, there's no gauge data available up there. So we relied on a combination of stream stats and the R2 cross process to make this recommendation. There are no active diversions on this reach. There had been some kind of historic conditional water rights up there associated with an old mine. Those were recently canceled when the applicants decided to stop filing diligence on them. So it's pretty unencumbered by water rights issues, but we would like to get back out there if we can this year and do another round of R2 cross assessment just because it was a pretty dry year last year. So similar stakeholders to Lattice Creek up there, the Conservancy District, CPW, Gunnison County. There's a significant amount of Forest Service land up there. This is one of the interesting basins that's almost exclusively Forest Service. And there's a very tiny amount of in-holding land up there associated with abandoned mines. And that pretty much sums up our recommendations. So if anybody has any questions, feel free to ask them now or follow up with me by email. I'd be happy to chat with anyone who wants to know a little bit more. Thanks.
So I think that's all for the presentations. We still have some time allocated for some more questions, if any have arisen since any of the other presentations. And while we're waiting for those, I can tell you too that I stated before that we're going to be posting all this stuff to our website. If anyone wants information before that gets posted to the website, please contact me and we can provide that to you beforehand as well. And Vivian, I just want to check, do we have anyone on the phone by any chance?
I think there may be just a couple participants on the phone, but they should be able to unmute themselves on their end.
Okay. Okay, like I said, if questions arise after you guys have had a chance to digest the information provided today, and you have more questions that do pop up, please just contact me or any other recommenders or other CWCV staff in the stream flow section, and we'd be happy to answer and talk with you through any questions or issues you may have. Okay, any final thoughts?
Hey,
This is Linda. I wanted, oh, go on.
sorry, just talking about my daughter is practicing piano downstairs too, but my name is Ethan Scott. I'm with Bureau of Reclamation down in Durango, Colorado. And I'm going to throw my email address in the chat. We've got water on the La Plata River associated with wildlife mitigation area. And we'd be interested in information on potentially working those towards in-stream flow rights, if possible.
Okay, great. That sounds great, Ethan. Thank you.
Yep.
And I just gotta say, I'm kind of impressed you have your children doing something productive. Mine are probably playing video games during this whole presentation, so you should be proud that she's practicing piano.
We're pretty lucky, yeah.
So Linda, do you have any final thoughts?
I just wanted to thank everyone for coming and encourage you to get in touch with us if you have any questions or comments after this workshop.
Okay. Well, thank you everyone for attending, and everyone have a great rest of their afternoon.